Hi, and welcome back to the MilVet podcast. I'm your host, Brendan Aronson, and today I am joined by Dave Wan. Dave is a former member of the Air Force. He's a USAFA grad. He's found a calling in helping high earners with their finances. So if you're a high earner or you aspire to be one, you definitely are not going to want to miss this episode. We're going to be talking about the emotional and behavioral aspects of money. And it bears saying before we jump in, none of what we're going to be saying is financial or investment advice. Before we dive in, would love to invite you to subscribe, share the podcast with a friend. You can text it to them. Do not do that while you're driving to work in the morning. But when you park your car, text it to a friend, share it with someone that might enjoy the episode. Dave, thank you for joining us today.
Brandon, I am super pumped to be here. Can't wait for this conversation. Looking forward to it.
Me too, man. Dave, I've given the highest level overview humanly possible, but it's always great to hear it in the first person. Can you take a few minutes to tell us about yourself?
Yeah, so I grew up in a family where both my parents were immigrants of South Korea. And growing up, my brother and I just experienced a lot of hardship when it came to finances. My parents fought a ton, and it was really stressful growing up. So after I graduated from the Air Force Academy, I did everything in my power to avoid what they went through. And I thought the answers were get on a budget, increase your income, which naturally happens when you're in the Air Force and when you're an officer, the pay schedule, and spend less than you make. Those are, and maybe even choose the right investments for your 401k or your TSP, whatever it is. And so while those advices made sense to me, I tried to implement them in my life. And through some very tragic moments in my life, I still felt very stressed and anxious about money, despite me having saved more money than my parents have ever saved, having made more money than my parents have ever made. And I realized through those tragic moments in my life in 2016 and beyond, there's this emotional, deeply rooted emotional and behavioral component that is driven by our subconscious brain, which is formed during our upbringing. And so once I began to understand that and uproot, that's when my stress started to disappear. And now I use that to help other people relieve their financial stress.
It makes a ton of sense. Just like a bit of personal story here, and I don't think listeners of the podcast have ever heard this, but my relationship with money growing up was somewhat similar. My parents were not immigrants. They were high earners, but they did not manage their money terribly well. And that led to this really stressful feeling around money and my relationship with money, which permeates and has an impact on how I approach the world today of can never have enough, right? But why, I want to ask you, the first question I want to ask you is, why is money so stressful for people?
I think money is so stressful for people because we've literally given all of our identity and our power to it. We let it dictate our feelings, our thoughts, our behaviors, all across the board. And once you have given the keys and the power over to money, now you're letting money dictate how you feel, and your feelings turn into behaviors and character and action and whatever it is, right? And so we have to be able to distance ourselves and make sure that our self-worth is not determined by our net worth. And you have to be able to distance yourself and separate yourself from it, because as long as it's connected, it's going to literally drive everything that you do.
I think it's especially stressful. Your points around having, power and identity tied up in our financial worth, it makes sense to me. I would also flag that to me, the relationship with money feels like survival. If we were in a hunter-gatherer tribe and my basket of food was running low, I'd be like, oh shit, we got to get some nuts or some meat or something. Something's got to go in here because otherwise we're going to starve. And money is the modern, it is the what you use to exchange for literal survival needs, the bottom aspects of Maslow's hierarchy.
Yep. It's a core survival need in our society. And it's been like this for a very long time.
Yeah. I also think that American society in particular is particularly wrapped around the axle when it comes to physical possessions and using it as a signaling mechanism. Yep. So much of our identity is tied up in what we do. And oftentimes that is a proxy for the value that we create or provide to society. And so it's a complicated psychological thing.
No, it definitely is. And to take it one step further, I believe that a lot of those thoughts have a root to it. And it's stemming from somewhere. The University of Cambridge did a study back in 2013 that determined that our core money patterns and behaviors and habits are formed by the age of 7.
Hmm.
So I don't know if you remember like any dinner conversations that you've had with your parents before the age of 7 when it came to, hey, Brendan, make sure you put money into your Roth IRA, or make sure you get on a budget and make sure you spend less than you make. I don't know a single 7-year-old or a single adult that remembers those conversations before 7 years old. And so it all has to do with our money habits and behaviors as adults are all emotional, and it's tied directly to all the sum total of all the experiences, influences, exposures, all the above from the first 7 years of our lives, right? And so I'm a father of a 2-year-old, and I have another one on the way, but it's just like how I respond to things and how I model things to my kids, even if it has nothing to do with money, will have everything to do with money later on in their lives.
Given that we all have these psychological things at play as it pertains to money, we all have money, we aspire to have money, maybe we don't have money, which is like stressful in its own right, but it's something that affects all of us. And so my question that I want to ask is like, why is it such a third rail in our society or as human beings to talk about money? I never talk about it with almost anyone except for my partner, and I talk about it. We do a weekly financial meeting. It's on our mind. This is a recent phenomenon, by the way. We have not always done that. But why is it such a third rail to talk about it with other people?
So I believe since we have given all of our power and our identity is wrapped up in money, I believe, and this is a saying that I say in my keynotes, is money is the great revealer.
Hmm.
So all the emotions that are the underlying driver behind our money habits and patterns are also present in other areas of our lives. So if we have a tremendous, I'm just being very general here, but if we possess a tremendous amount of fear naturally, and we're like, we have a fear of the unknown, and you're like, I don't want to step into it and figure out what that is. I'm going to stay in the safe zone. How you spend your money is going to follow that pattern.
Yeah.
It's going to follow that path. If you are generous with your money, you're going to be generous with other things in life. If you are selfish with your money, you're going to be selfish with other things in life. So money, I describe it as like our patterns and behaviors with money is actually a really good blueprint to understand the other emotions that are vague and ambiguous to us in other areas in life. It's okay, I want to work out, and I want to work out consistently, or I want to go after this really high paying job, or I want to go after certain goals in life. And like, how come I can't do it? Or what's standing in my way? What's that emotion that's standing in my way? I think a really good blueprint is to look at our money, understand those emotions because they're a mirror to one another.
Hmm.
And so the reason why we don't talk about money as a society is because it will reveal every shortcoming and everything that's really bad about us and everything that's really good about us.
Hmm.
And I believe that's the reason why people don't want to talk about it, is because you're essentially opening up the closet door and letting people into your world. And how you behave with money is just that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting take on it, right? The idea that our natural psychological tendencies are reflected in how we handle money makes a lot of sense to me. And the example or the story that I guess I would tell or share is in my first startup, I felt a great deal of imposter syndrome. Still feel it today. I feel like it's true for many people that are reaching beyond their capability set. And one of the things that was scariest about it was not knowing how to make the business grow. I wasn't a good marketer. I wasn't a good salesperson at the time. I don't think that I am today, but I'm definitely better. And had this like fear that if I put myself fully out there and into the sales and marketing function of that business, that I would fail because I didn't know enough, which is a legitimate fear and an accurate one. At least I'm self-aware enough to know that I sucked at these things. And then I saw the same set of tendencies as it related to money. And so with this startup, as I've gotten better at being a founder, as I've grown as a human being, I've realized that the more time and attention that I pay to the things that are uncomfortable, and I'm not paying attention to, it unlocks the most growth. So for instance, like in the gym, I've been focused on core because I've got a really weak core. I've always just skipped abs at the end of the workout. And since I've started focusing on it, everything else has gotten better as a result. It was like a rate limiting step. And in business, it's the same thing. It's look at the ugliest part of your business. That's probably the rate limiting step. You probably can get good enough at it if you focus on it enough. And so I applied this same framework to money maybe a year ago. And I was like, it's time to get serious. I figure out like, what do I have? What do I want to be? Like, how am I going to handle this? And just from putting the time and attention into paying attention to it, it has had such positive downstream effects. And it's no longer like this dramatic fear. And so I feel like that is an example of what you're saying is this is reflected in other aspects of our lives. Would be curious if you had any additional thoughts that you wanted to add, or feel free to psychologically analyze me on my own podcast. You're welcome to do that.
I'll just give you examples of my own life, right? And so like my parents were in absolute trouble, right? When I was growing up. Their credit card debt was 4x their pre-tax income. 4x, right? There were months when my parents couldn't pay rent. There were my parents had 4 failed businesses. As immigrants, like one of the things they want to do is come over here and start a small business, whether it was a small restaurant, a dry cleaner, a shoe repair store, whatever it is, they wanted to start a business. All 4 of them failed. And then ultimately, when I was at the academy, my parents declared bankruptcy. And that was one of the 2 times ever in my life when my mom was crying over the phone. I've never heard her cry or seen her cry, except for it was only 2 times in my life, and that was one of them.
Yeah.
And everything that is happening in the inside, which is, and all those dynamics like carry over into like how you deal with your own money and how you feel about money, how you think about money, how you behave with your money. And those dynamics will create some sort of blocks and different obstacles, and they will manifest into certain behaviors, especially in the business world. And so for me, I work with organizations and actually sales teams within organizations, because how you show up in your sales role, how you talk about your services, how you talk about money, how you negotiate those contracts with prospects, clients, your internal team, everything, those dynamics, the root of it all is tied to your personal relationship with money and how you think, do, and behave with that. And so they're all connected. We're human beings. Like we can't like compartmentalize all this, right? It's just one big pot, right? And the dynamics with how we think, feel, believe, do with money is already complicated enough with just us, just me. But then you include a spouse into a marriage. Now you're adding their dynamics. When it comes to business, it's not just one person. Now you got 10 other people or 20 other people now that you got to deal with. And so it just gets very complicated. And the core of it all, in order to fix it, you have to start with yourself first. And then those lessons learned and the benefits ripple across the organization that way. But it's really fascinating that, like, for me, because of what my parents went through, I held onto my money very tightly. So all the money that I started to save when I was a lieutenant, I saved like a madman. I budgeted like a madman. And I also was scared to use the money that I saved.
Totally. Yeah, white knuckling.
So, yeah. And so I didn't put a single penny towards my TSP in my 20s. Single penny. And it was because of the fear of running out of money and losing money and the fear of the unknown and uncertainty. And so if you take a look at that, and then you look at me as an entrepreneur in the early years of my entrepreneurial journey, I was like, I'm going to do everything myself, even if it doesn't make sense, because I don't want to spend that extra money on marketing, on tech, on whatever. I'll do everything myself because I want to save that money. And it was really hard for me to let go. So for me, I had to really understand the root of it all, which goes way back to the beginning, not just, dude, just suck it up and spend money on this. Of course, it makes sense to spend money on different technology to automate and make your processes more efficient. Of course, it makes sense. I'm going to save a ton of time. My time is worth so much money, right? But I wasn't doing that because the emotional anchor that was holding me back was so big. I had to work on that first in order to address some of the smaller rocks.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to ask, clearly your experience growing up the child of immigrant parents has had a dramatic effect on your relationship with money. I want to ask if you've seen any particular idiosyncratic or like atypical behaviors as it pertains to money from the veteran population. And the reason that I ask is that obviously we interact with a lot of veterans, a veteran specific show, but I see veterans that are getting out of the military and they're like, sometimes they're just like weird. Sometimes they're deeply uncomfortable talking about salary, thinking about negotiating comp. And they are like, I want to do a great job and I know that I'll be rewarded for that. And I want to prioritize X and Y and Z. And I feel like I usually have to dig just a tiny bit to be like, okay, is money important to you in your next role? And it's, yeah, it's super important. It's important to everyone. But I feel like veterans try to keep it almost at like arm's length when they first get out. Have you seen any kind of idiosyncratic or like just interesting aspects of how veterans relate to money?
As you know, in the military, it's team first, right? And it's all about the team and what's best for the team. And it requires a shift in mindset to then focus on yourself when you transition out. Like, yes, you need to be able to speak up for yourself and say, I deserve this money or this salary because I am able to bring XXX to the table, whatever it is, right? And it is like speaking up for yourself is not just unique to the veteran community, but it is something that I have seen and that I have noticed. Like, chase after that dollar. Like, you don't need, I know with a guaranteed paycheck every 2 weeks in the military, you're like very used to it. And people are scared of the outside. It's natural to think that what you have in the military is safe and secure and whatnot, and what's on the outside is not. But that's actually not true. I think security is a ruse. So go out there and chase after your goals and dreams, and don't rely on that. Don't be afraid to speak up for yourself,
Yeah.
and get what you want and what you deserve, because you're not on this 3% raise every year, or like you have to put in so much time to get certain things. Like, shoot, if you could go after a really high paying job and it's 200% more than what you made the year before, like, go after it. You don't have to stick to this schedule that the military was giving you. And it was there for a reason, but you don't have to follow that, right? And it's important to get away from that and not conform to the norm.
Yeah. The additional aspects that I would add from just seeing a lot of people moving around in jobs is, one, if you're in a position where you're going to be negotiating compensation, which you can always negotiate comp. We have a whole podcast that we recorded with a woman named Gerda Malai, who I encourage people to go check out that episode of the pod if you're interested in compensation negotiations. But in general, I encourage people to think when they're negotiating to negotiate on behalf of your family. Like, it doesn't have to be about putting more money into your own pocket. And I spend time in sales. I know we're going to talk about salespeople here in a minute, but when I'm negotiating with a client, I think of doing so on behalf of my other teammates. It's like, I don't need this additional cash for my own pocket, but rather I want to bring it in so that we can pay our people, so that we can give them raises in the future, so that we can just do the things with the business that we want to do to make our employees' lives better. So having someone that you are negotiating for, I think, can be a helpful framework for thinking about compensation negotiation. I'd also toss out, go ahead, please.
Also, when it comes to negotiations, there's so many things that go into it, and you're able to negotiate the crap out of it. Deconstruct what that top line number is made of, right? Does it include healthcare? If you're retired military, you could say, no, I want an extra 15 grand in my pocket, and I don't want that healthcare included in my role here. So there's so many things you could like slice and dice to make sure you deserve and you get what you deserve. So it's important.
Yeah, I think I've got two other flags for folks. I think this next one it might take a minute for people to become accustomed to thinking in this way, but in the civilian workforce, your compensation is tied to the value that you create. So if you're in a role that is revenue producing for a business and you're putting points on the board, you are creating a lot of value for that company, which then gives you more negotiating power to be able to capture more of that value for yourself personally. Yeah. If you're in a non-revenue producing role, you're not in a sales role, you're maybe in an administrative role or something like that, it can be more difficult to then have those negotiations, because where you fall on the P&L is not adding to the top line, but rather it is an expense. oftentimes it's super critical. It's very important. It's high value, but it's not as directly tied to the financial metrics of the business, which can make it more difficult. So again, I encourage people to think about the value creation. What value are you creating? And then what value are you able to then capture because of that? The other flag that I throw out for folks is that typically we see the biggest jump in compensation when we move jobs. It's an employer might give you a pay raise. You're probably going to get a bigger pay raise when you move from company A to company B. And so those transition points can be really important.
I could not agree with you more on that. In the military, you're like in this mindset of I'm here for the long haul. And while that mindset is important on the outside as well, it's important to understand that you need to take care of yourself. And sometimes where you're currently at may not be it. And sometimes the company that you're at, I've seen this before too, may not have the right opening or the resources to train you to get to that next level. And so it's important for you to fill in that gap by potentially going somewhere else and then coming back if you want to, right?
Totally. I'm going to speak out of both sides of my mouth now. So I've said you can capitalize on moving jobs in terms of your compensation, and that can be a stepwise function. I would also tell folks, people jump around jobs a lot nowadays. It's more typical, obviously, for our generation than our parents. I would say that as you get more senior in your career, one of the things that our clients are oftentimes looking for more senior or executive roles is longevity in a role. How long are you going to come and leave? Are you going to stay? And so now that I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, when you do move, that is an ideal time to be capturing additional value and have the opportunity for a stepwise change in your income. But consider those moves carefully. And ideally, if you're going to position yourself well in the long term for a career, you are going to build some longevity in each of those roles. It's going to be beneficial as you go for more senior roles. Dave, I want to pivot the conversation just a little bit and ask you about what types of clients that you work with, because I know that your services are not for everyone. I'd just like to hear a little bit more about what types of folks that you're typically working with and then why.
Right now, we are niching down, and I'll be focusing on supporting sales teams within organizations, larger sales teams. And the reason why is sales professionals are essentially business owners, right? They are business owners, and they own and run their own set of accounts and books. And how they show up in that role is greatly influenced by their personal relationship with money. And so for me, sales teams have a lot of pressure to perform. They are highly incentivized folks. They are resourced because they are the money maker and the lifeblood of a company. And we've pivoted and are now focusing our attention on providing sales teams with a program that helps each individual person identify some of the subconscious barriers that are standing in their way from meeting their potential or exceeding their potential in their role. And all of that, the blueprint, is tied to their personal relationship with money. And so we've niched down not on industry, but on role and the type of role that you have within the company. And so before, I used to go after organizations and their entire workforce and provide them this financial wellness program. While that was good, the people that have gravitated and the conversations that I've had gravitated towards sales teams. So it was natural for me to move in that direction. And the conversations have been super exciting. And me as a former sales guy, I'm really excited to go back to where I started after my military career and help those guys out with a new angle to help them exceed and just crush their performance.
It's super cool. I love salespeople. They're like, I don't know. They just have a special place in my heart. I'm going to use this term in a loving way because I would use it to apply to myself, like a big dumb animal. That's how I feel. That's how I felt in the infantry. That's how I feel as like a salesperson, is like salespeople. There's just like a type. They're wonderful. But I want to ask you, like, what kind of quirks are you seeing among salespeople or business owners as it pertains to their relationship with money?
Can you expand on like quirks?
Yeah, like I have a hypothesis.
Are you thinking like just commonalities, or what are you looking at?
Yeah, like I have a hypothesis that for salespeople or business owners, sometimes like there might be a propensity to judge yourself or how good you are at your job and like the pride that you take in your job as like a direct analog or corollary to the amount that you're earning, the amount that you're putting up in terms of revenue, profit, etc. I'm just curious if that's like a generalizable thing. Is that true of salespeople?
Actually, what you just said hits it. It's bullseye. A lot of people correlate how much they make to their self-worth. And there is what I've also seen is a handful of those drivers that I've seen around is a tendency to prove somebody wrong.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, from what I've seen, this is just my examples. In their early years, they were told, "You're not good enough. You're not going to make it. You're going to fail." And that is a big driver in saying, "I'm going to crush this goal. I'm going to crush it in my work. I'm going to make $1 million a year, and I'm going to prove that person wrong." Now, this is a money issue because the emotions that are driving your desire to succeed, while it might look good on the outside, the underlying driver that is below the surface is not healthy. And when you have a massive desire to prove someone or something wrong, you're going to be making decisions that may or may not be completely rational. And you're going to be taking shortcuts and trying to accelerate a few things when you shouldn't be. It's important to slow down sometimes when you're not. So your decision making is going to be impacted because of that. And it's important to understand where that's coming from. And a lot of that is from our early years. And so this is like how I bring this up from a high level in a corporate sense and in a corporate setting, how people could overcome some of these subconscious barriers that are standing in their way. And while chasing after goals and making $1 million a year for whatever company is fine, if you're approaching it in an unhealthy way, that stress is going to boil over one day, and it's not going to look pretty, and you're going to be stuck in this hamster wheel. And my hope is for people to make tens of millions of dollars every year, but do it in a way where it's sustainable and healthy, and your stress level is not high.
Yeah, that's an awesome goal for all of us, for sure. What does your process look like when you're working with a client? If you were to onboard a new client, like what does that look like? What do you do for them? Curious to hear a little bit about it.
Yeah, I going through the discovery process, just understanding I hate the word financial wellness because it's used everywhere, but that's essentially what I do. And I just want to know their process looks like now. If they have a program that they've adopted, I like to understand their workforce and some of the pain points that their workforce is facing. And as I begin to understand their organization more, what I've noticed across the board is a lot of the programs that companies have adopted are like very tech heavy and very like, hey, we have this app and you could set up your budget through there, or here's what I call a big ass calculator that you could input your income. And now, oh, Brendan, you should save 15%. And here's what that looks like. A lot of the programs that are out there are that, plus maybe some educational courses. And a really sweet 401k offering and choosing the right investments. All these are great, but they still don't really address the underlying behavior behind why we do what we do. And because it's such a personal topic, I believe it needs a personal approach. And so our offerings, I keynote speak for organizations and conferences and stuff, but I come in and I do workshops. I believe that face to face, whether it's virtual or in person, it needs a personal touch. And so I tend to focus on the money side, but then the emotions and the behaviors with money will also transcend everywhere else. So I have a very holistic approach to the workshops that I host.
Awesome. Super cool. I need to check out one of these workshops. They sound really like fun, interesting, exciting.
I love them, man. Tons of energy. I love it.
Yeah. We're going to double click on maybe just some quick takes that you might have or just generalized advice here in a minute. But I want to ask first, what generalizable advice do you have for high earners, for salespeople, for business owners, for veterans? Like what is like the general, if you were just like, hey, I've got 1-2 minutes to ramble about here's generalizable advice, what would it be?
Man, I'm going to probably exceed 2 minutes here, but two things. Everything right now that you hear is going to be save and invest what you're making, right? Don't go into debt. Don't spend more than you make. And all these are practical. They're nuts and bolts. And so those are important. So I'm going to focus on that right now. The practical aspect of money. Get on a plan, understand where your money is going, and make sure you invest money for the future. And make sure you understand how much you're saving and what you're spending money on and all that stuff. Understand where all those numbers are going. Okay, that's the practical side. The emotional side is why you are saving and spending the way you do. So I think it's really important to understand why you spend and save money the way you do. One of the things that I say is what's more important than the action itself is the emotion that's actually driving those actions. So if you're saving money like I did out of fear, I have tons of fear because I wanted to avoid what my parents went through. Imagine me saving 65% of my income, which is what I did as a lieutenant, and doing that on repeat for 40 years. Now I have, let's just say, $3 million in the bank at 60 years old. Do you think I could turn the light switch on and go, I could just save with freedom now? So I think it's really important to understand, get on a plan. All those things are great, but it's really important to understand the drivers behind those numbers. So you have to be able to merge the practical aspect and the emotional aspect together. And so that's the tip that I would share people is the emotions that are driving those numbers, the practical side is really important to know. If you're spending or saving out of fear, I encourage people to save and spend as much money as they can. But if you're doing it out of an emotion that is unhealthy and causing you that stress, that internal stress that not a lot of people might be able to see, it's inside of you, you have to be able to address that as soon as possible. So that's my advice.
That's good advice. I feel like your advice could probably, and to your point, like all of these different psychological phenomenons are applicable more broadly than just money. But I feel like this emotional side that you're describing is like self-awareness. Like how do you build self-awareness as it pertains specifically to money, which self-awareness is like probably one of the most important and helpful like life hacks, business hacks. It's not a hack, it's just like a way of being, but I find it just remarkably helpful across.
Self-awareness is, I created a 4-step process. Step awareness is step 1.
Yeah, makes sense.
So my step 1 is identify. You have to be able to identify what's going on because a lot of what we do, 95% of what our thoughts and actions are actually subconscious. Only 5% is conscious.
System 1.
Only 5% is conscious. So you have to be able to understand the brain and understand that what I'm doing is subconscious, like a lot of what I do. So you have to be able to identify it. Second step is investigate it. Where is this coming from? So you got to work through all that history. And then the third step is healing. You have to be able to heal from it. And that could take a lot of time. And the fourth step is thrive. Actually putting a budget together, actually putting your money where you want and make sure it lines up with your goals and being able to execute it, making sure that habits on a daily basis are done. So those are it. But yeah, step 1 is self-awareness, man. It's so important. And I have to harp on the fact that it's not just knowing it. It is half the battle, but you have to be able to execute on it as well.
Yeah. Now you sound like a Marine Corps recruiter. It's like the first core value of our beloved Corps is know self and seek self-improvement. It's such helpful advice for life and certainly for money. I want to ask for some quick takes. You mentioned a couple of times like the practical aspects of this is like putting together a budget. I'm curious if you have any like recommendations for how people should go about doing that, how people should think about it. I'll just share, I've used a couple of apps in the past that I have had good results with. YNAB, youneedabudget.com, is a zero-based budgeting app where you assign every dollar that you currently have to different categories out into the future. And it basically allows you to see your runway and how much cash you have on deck for how far it's going to take you. That I found to be super helpful, especially as a broke entrepreneur who needed to know what my personal runway looked like. And then today I use Monarch Money, which I like a lot. I think that their like reporting is super helpful. And it's just, I find it to be a helpful user-friendly tool. But curious to hear any recommendations that you have for tools that you might like, the tools that you advise your clients to use, or how to approach budgeting and tracking inflows and outflows more generally.
I think when it comes to budgeting, I think there's 4 different areas that you need to focus on. The first one is income. What's your income? The second one is fixed expenses. So fixed expenses that are predictable and happening on a monthly basis. And this does not include, in my opinion, it does not include going out to eat, groceries, and groceries, and gas. That's the second category. The third one is discretionary, and that includes groceries, going out to eat, gas, Amazon, Walmart, movies, whatever. And then the fourth one is saving and putting money aside for saving, investing, whatever goals that you have. I created my own little spreadsheet. It looks really nice. A lot of my former clients, one-on-one clients that I used to have a long time ago, have used it. When I was teaching at the Air Force Academy and I would give that out to my cadets, they still reach out to me and say, this has helped a lot, and I still use it. And this is what, 8 years ago? So I created my own. But honestly, I'm very neutral with everything out there. And I say that because whatever app is easy for you to use, it doesn't give you that much stress. There's no like hard barrier between you using it. I think you should use whatever is best. Some people, even though I've tried to change their mind, will go pen and paper. Whatever you want to do. I think that real-time feedback is important. So if you've given yourself $1,000 a month for discretionary, you should be able to have a system that says, okay, I just spent $10 at this restaurant. I now have $990 left, and I know that real time. I think that real-time data is, and that feedback is important. And I think YNAB gives you that feedback. So my answer is whatever is easiest and doesn't give that much resistance for you to use is what you should go with.
Got it. I want to ask, how do you think about folks that are interested in buying a house? Any general advice that you might have for folks that are interested in purchasing a house versus renting?
I want to stray away from all the answers that are out there when it comes to people answering this question. What I would suggest is, why do you want to buy the house? And you have to peel back each layer of the onion. And there's a logical reason and a rational reason as to why we do what we do. In sales, there's a common saying that we buy with emotions but rationalize with logic. So you are going to rationalize with logic by saying, I have 4 kids, I need this house, I need X amount of bedrooms and this much space. And I get that. I totally get it. But I think it's also important to tap into your emotional side and really ask yourself why you're buying it. Instead of the house, I'm going to use an example of a car for me. When I was deployed, I came back and bought a brand new 2013 F-150 truck. And all the reasons that I have for buying it were logical and rational. I'm moving across the country, PCSing from DC to Los Angeles. I need space for my household goods I need to haul them. I want to go on trips with friends. I need some space in the back, right? So all these, and I had money to spend it. I had money saved up for my deployment. So while that was a very logical reason, the underlying reason as to why I bought the truck was highly emotional. Mm-hmm. And I've shared this story a handful of times. I'm very comfortable sharing it. It did take me a long time for me to open up on this. But the reason why I bought the truck was because of my desire for people's approval.
Yeah.
And if you buy the house, I think it's really important to understand. It's important to peel back the layers of the onion and understand why you're actually buying it 5 layers deep. And here's another question that I have posed. If you are trying to go after $1 million home and there's 5 bedrooms and whatever, the other question that you should pose to yourself is, if I could get a different house that's technically still meets all of its requirements, like 3,000 square feet, 5 bedrooms, it could still fit my family, it's still running fine, there's no like major damage to the house, and it's $400,000, in your mind, would you get the cheaper option? Yes or no? And if you answered no, even though it meets all the technical capabilities, how come you're going for the more expensive one? So I think when it comes to renting and buying and all these things, there's a lot of different questions on the emotional side that needs to be asked and answered. So yes, there's a number side to this. Like, I get it. Um, Another thing with buying houses, people need to understand the amortization table because it's what when owning a home, 30-year mortgage, the first 10 years is like what, 80% interest, 30% more principal. It goes to 50-50 the next 10 years, and then the last 10 years is like 20-80, right? And there's a number side to this. I get that. You're going to hear that everywhere. But the emotional side is there's a reason. Understand the reason why you're buying it. Because for me, after I bought the truck and the high of getting people's approval wasn't met and it wore off, I sold the truck less than a year later.
It's a bummer.
But I just truly believe it's really important to ask and understand that aspect before you jump into something.
It's a good flag. I'm thinking about buying a house and thinking about what the next steps look like for my family. And yeah, these are good flags. I was going to ask you about some other topics like buying cars, potentially thinking about investing, but I suspect that a lot of the answers that you would give would be somewhat similar. Hey, understand the emotional aspect of this first and foremost. So rather than doing that, I want to ask you, what's the most surprising thing that you've learned from peeking under the hood at people's financial situation? And this will be one of the questions that brings us home. I've got one or two others, but yeah, I just would be curious. You have a unique spot that you sit in, talk to a lot of people about finance. What are some of the most surprising things that you've seen or learned?
At this point, nothing is surprising to me. But what I have learned through this process is it's important to address everybody's I'm not going to call out his name, but there is a really popular personal finance guru in this industry. And this person tends to shame a lot of the people that come onto his show for the decisions that they make. And I believe that a lot of our money patterns and behaviors are formed from our early years. A lot of it is subconscious. And so I believe it is wrong to shame people for their money decisions and actually approach that with empathy and compassion and really understand what's going on. Because when you get to the root of it, it could be surprising for the individual and it could be very painful. But I believe going through that process is necessary to actually release the emotional anchor that's actually holding them back and be able to put them on a new trajectory so they can make wise and sound and conscious financial decisions for the future. That's the one thing I've learned, is to be able to have a level of understanding for people's decisions and understanding that a lot of the decisions that they make, the unhealthy ones especially, are rooted in their upbringing. It's subconscious, and you have to approach that with a lot of empathy and compassion.
Makes a ton of sense. Dave, last question I want to ask you is, where can listeners learn more about your work and support your work?
Yeah, the only social that I have is LinkedIn. So it's at Dave Won, WON. And my website, davewon.co. And if you also want to check out my TED Talk, is on YouTube. And the title of that is You're Not Bad with Money.
Sweet. Yeah, I should have led off by saying congratulations on the TED Talk. I know that was a huge deal, and it's awesome, man. Super cool.
No, thanks, man. Appreciate it.
If you're listening to the podcast, if you enjoyed it, you would love our in-person events. We just had one in Dallas last week that was awesome. It was so sick. It was like 70 folks showed up, 70 to 80 people. Great Americans. I had an absolute ton of fun, reconnected with some old friends, met some new friends. It was just awesome to see people trying to help one another. Check out our in-person events. You can see them all at themilvet.org/events. Guys, we are adding new events every single week. We have events in the next 6 months. We're recording this on the 26th of September. We have events coming up in DC, Philly, Salt Lake City. It's not even ski season yet, and we're coming out to Salt Lake City. We will definitely be back there during ski season. We've got them in San Francisco. We've got them I think we've got one in Colorado. We've got one in New York City in November. So there are events coming to your towns. We've got Miami in March for Emerge Americas. So check out themilvet.org/events. Join us at one of our live events. We're also signing up new clients every week. If you're looking for a new gig, check out the milvet.org/careers. Sign up for the newsletter where you'll get information about the events, the podcast, and the careers at the milvet.org. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you back here next week.